Hey everybody, I'm Ozzy. I hope you guys are doing well, staying healthy, and continuing to just keep up with this whole adjustment that we're all going through. Um, I thought I'd share today a bit of a topic that I commonly talk about in my practice, um, which is cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And I think it's always helpful. Of course, if a client obviously objects, we don't really go into it if that's really something they're against. But I've never had a client that's been against learning what cognitive therapy is, because cognitive therapy, I think, is a very applicable type of therapy for anybody. Even just learning about it, I think, in one's life can be helpful, and that's partially why I'm doing this, is to help teach, at least the way I teach it when I work with clients in my practice. Just a quick little heads up, I'm Ozzy. I'm one of the therapists here at the practice, and I've been doing individual counseling for about 6, 7 years, and I've been doing the work in mental health for about 13 years. A lot of the cool things that I find that happen in therapy when I'm talking to my clients is that it's really there's a real cool flow that happens, and we're really both in that moment talking about whatever is important to them, about their life or about their struggle, about whatever they're going through, whatever they're figuring out. And sometimes we really get into it to a point where, it's that you're in the zone feeling, you're in this flow concept that this one particular a person in psychology, I can't even figure out the name, Mahali Csikszentmihalyi, that was his name. He was a guy in positive psychology, if I'm not mistaken. And he came up with a concept called flow. Maybe for another video I'll talk about that. But in session, you can get flow where you and your client are really onto something. And it's this really cool feeling. More so for the client who's really making headway and understanding a little more about themselves or about the problems or solutions. And, don't fall. I have this thing propped up on a very shabby Old Spice rack, so we'll see if my whiteboard lasts. I always have my whiteboard in my therapy office, because like I say, I like to educate clients as part of my therapy. I believe that when I can teach them some of the things I have learned in my 7 years of education, I think it helps them understand what they're going through, and we start talking about, their life and their issues and so forth. So I thought today would be a good idea to talk about cognitive therapy the way I talk to my clients about it. It's not going to be 100% the same, because obviously you guys aren't sitting here in my office. I'm not even in my office, actually. Welcome to my basement. With this whole quarantine and working from home, we've all been, for the most part, working remotely. And so I've been doing my video and phone sessions here in my little corner of the basement, in the gaming desk and office desk that I have. So yeah, welcome to my cozy little basement here. So my whiteboard, though, is always with me in my office, and I always use it to visualize things. I like to try to use visuals when I talk about things in therapy. Even when we're trying to discuss something, me and a client, we're trying to figure out maybe something that they feel or understand, and they can't find the right words. So sometimes we'll draw things out. I think it's kind of helpful. So anyways, this is going to be very unstructured in that I'm not going to be as formal as I guess a presentation ought to be, maybe. But that's part of it, right? I'm over here making a video from my basement, for goodness sakes, in hopes that you guys maybe learn something from this process. This is a process I learned in my education, and I think it's a very useful type of therapy. It's a good evidence-based type therapy. And let me tell you about it. So cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy was developed by a guy named Aaron Beck. And this was like one of the big dudes in psychology back in the day, right? So Aaron Beck was like this doctor, this therapist, and I guess one way to look at it is his clients that he had worked with started coming up to him to some degree, if I remember the history right. They were coming up to him complaining to some degree about problems with thoughts, being burdened by repetitive thinking, or getting burdened by like constant images of certain worries in their mind. And when he was working with them, he started to kind of wonder what's up with these like trip ups cognitive that they have. They seem to get focused or preoccupied, etc. And from that research and from that inquiry, he found and discovered what we now call cognitive distortions. And from that process, he developed cognitive therapy, I believe. And cognitive therapy is about looking at the way that you interpret your world around you. It's about looking at your thoughts and looking at whether they're rational, whether they're irrational, how that impacts your feelings, and how that translates into the actions that you take in the world. In cognitive therapy, we talk about this process, this little thing I'm going to show you here. They call it the cognitive process. This little ABC, you like my pointer here? This little ABC process of things. I remember in school, they always told us the ABCs of CBT. And what it is, as I've come to understand it, just like a cardiologist might explain to me in a very short, maybe 10-minute, 5-minute, not even 10 minute, maybe 5-minute verbalization of the flow of blood through my heart, right? They might explain the way that it goes through this artery and into that ventricle, into that chamber, and this way and that way and this, and that's the flow of the blood through your heart. One way I'm looking at this is basically, I want you guys to think of it like, I'm going to show you the process of things when you as an organism in this reality decide to come across some situation, and then what happens, what follows, why do we do what we do, why do we say what we say, think what we think, act like we act, what determines all that in a situation? That's one of the big questions I've always had as to why I even went into this field. Why do people do what they do? So I think this is not a bad way of looking at it and exploring that question. And this process, this ABC process, is one way to explain it. Things go from this way, this way, this way. There's this process that happens, again, when you enter a situation, are exposed to the stimulus, the information, whatever's going on around you, interpret what's happening, feel and react, and then act. That process happens so fast. It happens on a normal basis, what we would maybe say whatever's normal, and then it also happens in abnormal ways or maladaptive ways. And I'm going to explain those. So often when I'm talking about this with clients, usually we're talking about more personal things, what's going on with them, whatever's going on with their anxiety, depression, other things, whatever, right? And as they start to talk to me, I start listening to the way that they're describing their problems, their struggles. And I'm almost always guaranteed to find in the first at least 20, 30 minutes, some perspective that they have that seems slightly skewed or slightly distorted. And that's where I usually use this as an introduction to say, let's talk about this thing. Because as we move forward in my sessions with my clients, I'm going to challenge those distorted thoughts because it's maybe surrounded by their struggles, surrounded by maybe their hot button topics, surrounded by their people in their life that they struggle with. Those distorted things, what are distortions? Cognitive distortions are they're like thought fallacies. They're ways of looking at something that isn't fully rational. They're irrational ways of looking at something. Distortions put a slight frame on reality that seems believable but is actually kind of false because of some presumption, some judgment, some distorted way of looking at it. One way it's come up in session, I remember one client describing it like you have 70% of it seems accurate, but 30% is obviously not right. And the 70% of it seems so much more accurate of what you're looking at, how you're judging it, that you go with it. But if you really broke it down, you'd find that maybe 30, maybe 20, maybe 10% of it was wrong or off or unknown. So we try to look at how that process happens. And when I notice it in session, I start to use that as a way to open up into the topic. And oftentimes I ask clients, isn't it funny the way our thoughts are? If you guys, whoever's watching me right now, do you ever think about the way you think? Do you ever stop and wonder how you think? Why you think the way you think? Where that even comes from? Some of us maybe know exactly where it comes from. We know exactly where that message was taught or told to us or where we learned it from. Some of us, maybe we realize where did I learn to think like that? Where did I learn to think of it like this or look at it that way? Sometimes we don't realize we've been using the same way, but never actually stop to think about it and whether or not we liked it. So thoughts are often this thing, man. They can be tricky. I remember one professor telling me thoughts have no power until you act on them. I don't know, maybe not, but I think it was a good statement nonetheless, helpful that we often bring up in session. So the thoughts are the big factor in CBT. There's these parts to it. Let's go over them. Right, so everything starts with a situation. You have situations or events or triggers, right? Whatever that is. Now, I often ask clients, of all these thoughts that we're often having, right? We're having thoughts all the time. I think there's some studies that say something like 75,000 thoughts a day or something like that, which is a lot of thoughts. That's a lot of thoughts. So, of all those thoughts, how do we stop and sort whether they're good, rational, are they accurate? We're not going to, not all the time. This is why I also tell clients those distortions, they're part of the system that we have, the way our brain works. We're vulnerable to them, basically. Any human is. I'm sure Gandhi even had distortions. I'm sure, anybody had distortions. Anne Frank probably had distortions, right? People, they're people. We're humans. And so because of that, we're vulnerable. And because of that, we're not perfect. And so I think that sometimes when we don't have enough information in a situation, our brain stitches whatever it can to just make as much sense as it can to make it through that moment. And sometimes what we stitch together isn't 100% accurate. So you start with a situation, event, or trigger. And how many situations and events and triggers do you guys think you go through most often in a day, in an average day, right? Depends how you look at that. Maybe we're all looking at the big problems, right? Like you have a very difficult friend, right? And they text you throughout the day at least 2 or 3 times a day. So you might be looking at this and being like, well, I can probably think about 2 or 3 situations that might happen today, right? Perhaps you know that you struggle at school or dealing with schoolwork. And it's like, well, I know at some point I'm going to have to take, a break and deal with that mound of work that I have been avoiding. So maybe there's like one situation I can think of. True, we can look at it this way. What are the problems in my life? And those count as the situations or events that I have to deal with. But I also like to push clients to think, how about the thought that situations are constantly happening? Because time unfolds in front of us. Every second's a new second. Every minute's a new minute. Right? 20 seconds from now, who knows what I'm going to say? I kind of know, but I don't know. So to me, there's always situations going on, which is why I say, like, our brain is always moving, always going. On a computer screen, you see that little hourglass ticking back and forth, a little arrow thing circling like it's thinking. We're always doing that. And we're always doing that in reaction to what's going on. You know what I liken it to sometimes? If any of you guys watching this know how those Google cars work, those Google map cars, with the cameras on top that look like big old mechanical pineapple things, like, I don't know. But they sit there at spin and scan with lasers and sensors what's going on around the car constantly. That's kind of like what we're doing. Constantly thinking, assessing on what? We're not using cameras and lasers and sensors. No, we're using thoughts, beliefs, values that we hold dear, whether or not we know them and define them. And that's kind of scary when you think about it. Some of us are acting on undefined values. And sometimes I look at my job as helping clients define those values better, so that way they know the actions they take are much more aligned with the person they want to be. So you have situations, events, and triggers. And every time a situation, event, or a trigger happens, you're going to think, you're going to have an opinion, you're going to process, what do I make of this going on right now? Sometimes we look at thoughts or attitudes like the kind of glasses you wear that you're looking through in the world, And those thoughts right here is where I say we have those rational or irrational thoughts. The whole, am I looking at something really accurate or not? And where does that even come from, right? Well, depends what knowledge you have, depends what experience you've had in life, depends what you believe. The thought of a 5-year-old may be very irrational, but it makes sense because they're only 5 years old, right? That's why it's hard. Sometimes I have to really break down and have a client explain to me where they're coming from with that thought. Sometimes we take the whole session, half the session, just to understand where they're coming from with a thought. That's okay. So sometimes I tell people in therapy, it may go slow to some degree in that we focus on a topic and we stick on that one topic or issue. Even though you wanted to talk about 10 other things, it was really important to talk about that one thing because that thing is really stemmed into what they're doing, perhaps. So, beliefs and thoughts and opinions. When those things happen, when you start having thoughts, your emotions start to screw around. And I say screw around because a lot of times my clients can all, for the most part, in the beginning, commonly agree emotions are tough and they're hard to control and they can be downright frustrating sometimes, right? So with feelings, the way I like to explain it to clients, feelings are not good or bad. Please do not look at feelings as good or bad. Don't start divvying them up as positive and negative or the good side, the bad side. I believe emotions just are. They just are. You need them all. They're part of the human experience. And all the feelings you have, maybe there's more to know about them that we don't even know, probably. But those feelings are your right to have. Now, whether or not you know why you're having that feeling, that's another thing, right? So your feelings are never wrong, but what conclusion you draw to make that feeling the reaction you choose to go with, that can be questionable, right? What I'm saying is the emotions are never wrong. You know, even though, yeah, I don't think that was appropriate to feel that way, maybe in that moment, or maybe I didn't think I needed to feel that strongly. But I mean, hey, man, you felt it, that's okay, right? Maybe that's all right. But what is questionable is the thought, the belief, the opinion. Is that accurate? Was that rational? Was that irrational? You know, was it not based on full reality? If that was questionable, then this changes, right? The thought being, if you can reframe the distorted thought to something more rational and appropriate, the emotion aligns to a much more appropriate level, matches better. So I kind of look at it like having these two parallel, continuums, these two parallel highs and lows, these two parallel spectrums, right? So one of them's thoughts, the other one's feelings. And on your thought, it's a spectrum of rationality and irrationality. Right? What makes good sense, objectivity based on facts and evidence, etc., and what's based on presumptions, falsitivities, fallacies, judgments, assumptions, etc. On the emotional scale, it's about the continuum of high or low and high, right? How intense. So if it's anger is the scale we're looking at, we can go, angry or upset or frustrated to something more like livid or pissed off or enraged, right? Something really intense. So when a thought is irrational, there's more likelihood that that feeling is going to go to a more intense level. And sometimes we try to work at reframing in therapy to move that thought to a more rational place. And maybe a more rational place garners a more appropriate feeling on that scale. So it's like you are allowed to feel whatever that feeling is, but maybe the feeling to a certain degree is too much. It's another reason why I tell clients, you're okay to feel what you want to feel. Your feelings aren't bad. So one of the misconceptions sometimes that I have is, or that I get in therapy, is that when I start teaching this, clients will tell me, so the CBT is about making my negatives into positives. Trying to change my outlook into a no, not always. Not always, but sometimes it helps. It's not always like that because some situations do require you to accept the fact that it's not a great situation, right? So, with everything going on right now with this pandemic, take grief, for example, sadness and death. When somebody passes, there might be an individual, and I've actually had cases like this in the past where it's like they're going through grief. And they come into session and the big overall perspective is there's a lot of distortion, right? So they look at something about the way that person passed away or something about their passing, and the way they're thinking about it is distorted. Some common ones might be they personalize it, right? They think to some degree the death was their fault. They could have done more. They should have done more, right? They start shitting on themselves. That's a joke we say in therapy. Don't shit on yourself. Should is a cognitive distortion, one of the 10 that Beck discovered. Should statements, we joke, don't shit on yourself. But we say should all the time, and those are actually under the umbrella of absolute statements. So should, must, have, need, ought. Those words can carry sometimes a lot of meaning behind them about pressure or, ultimateness or ultimatum or something. A sense of perfection or authoritative demand that if not met, the consequences suck for the person. Right? So it's like this pressure that one might have. So, my point, take death, for example. Someone's going through grief. And in that grief, they're having these should statements. I should have been there more for them. I should have done this. Say it's me and this other friend. And I see in this friend that, clearly the person who passed away it's not the fault of this person that they passed. And so when they talk to me, they're telling me these distorted things, it's my fault, and I'm never going to see them again, and I should have done more, and this and that. And I may talk with them at first to kind of help them challenge those thoughts and encourage them to maybe look at, what is true, right? Like, well, at least you'll be able to think about them, and maybe we can go visit their grave once a year, and do some kind of, commemoration thing every year, some kind of tradition we can do and gather by the headstone and do something once a year, to kind of celebrate their life or something. So it's not like you'll never see them again. You won't physically, but they'll still be in your heart, man, Or maybe it's like, yeah, it wasn't your fault, man. Like, the person starts learning and getting more accepted to the fact that, well, they were in the middle of this thing and they were trying to be the best friend they could, and they were there as much as they could. Their death was not their fault. In the end, maybe the person decided to make certain choices, or it was just a complete accident. Nobody had any fault of their own. Nobody knew that car was going to do that, right? So regardless, the person starts to let go of the distorted, the distorted way of looking at something, changing the feeling a little bit more. That initial way, maybe think of it like maybe like a poisonous red kind of color, whatever. I think of this distorted way of my fault and I should have, probably elicited feelings like, hopelessness, maybe depression, maybe frustration, maybe self-loathing perhaps, maybe anger, things like this. And now maybe after a month of maybe, doing some grief counseling, maybe even just taking time to themselves, thinking about some of the things that I might have talked to the person about, that person comes back and tells me their perspective again. And their perspective is like I'm saying, you're right. I decided that once a year I'm going to go to their grave and read this story. It's a story that we read back when we were kids and blah, 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 and this and that. And you're right. I do think of them throughout the day, and it's really nice to know that they're in my memory and they're in my heart, and I can always recall them and this and that. And when I ask them how you feel about things, they may tell me, I don't feel as hopeless or helpless, or I don't feel as depressed. I still feel sad. I miss them. They're gone. I still feel some sense of emptiness maybe. But it's not hopelessness. It's not depression. And that's good. So sometimes I tell clients cognitive therapy is really helpful because it's not always about changing it to a positive. Hell, if that happens, that's great. That's just a nice little, little dessert. That's great. That's awesome when that can happen. It's not like I don't want that to happen. Of course, that's a good thing. We look for that. But a lot of times too, it's more about feeling the appropriate level, suitable for who we are as a person. And that comes out in therapy, how they want to react, how they want to think about it. They also got to add a little bit of who they are to that truth. So we sit there and now look at our emotions and our beliefs. Sorry, I'm getting text messages from upstairs because, like I said, I'm in the basement. So anywho, as this process continues, you have your situation, you start to have thoughts, you start to have feelings. Those feelings and thoughts mix together like some, oxygen and fuel mixture, and this combustion happens. And that combustion is our behavior, our reaction. How do we act? And this process, this little ABC, boom, 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 think of them like light bulbs, boom, 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 boom. This process happens all the time, and sometimes we're doing it in like split seconds. But we're doing it in normal ways, healthy ways, ways that work rationally fine for us. And then sometimes we're doing them in not so healthy ways. Moments where we sit and maybe are looking at it in a very distorted manner. So the consequencing behavior, the habit, it could be bad, good, question mark, we'll talk about that in a minute. Or how we deal with AIDS, and the way I verbalize it. I try to encourage clients to remember, whatever this unhealthy behavior is, oftentimes we call it maladaptive, it's unhealthy. 90% of the time, it's trying to alleviate what's going on here. We're all, like I say, maybe all the time, we're trying to alleviate what's going on in A. We're trying to deal with it. There's this idea of fight or flight, very true. And sometimes in situations that stress us out or are difficult or whatever, we kind of look at that in a fight or flight manner, even if we know we're not in life and death. But it might be something we're not prepared for, we don't like, or we're not used to, and so it's kind of, we're not used to it. We're kind of uneasy, we're not prepared. So it's like a fight or flight thing, and so whatever this response is can sometimes be often seen as trying to help what's going on over here. But when we look at what is it that we actually do, yeah, it can be maladaptive, right? What do I mean by that? So when these things start to happen, like I say, in the end, we have to react in some way. And sometimes that reaction can be unhealthy. It can be, you know, something as what some might consider benign is something like napping. It could be deciding to shut down and nap, right? Every time I get depressed and I start thinking about how, and as an example, right? Every time I get depressed and I start thinking about how miserable my life is gonna be, right? And I'm only in high school, or I'm only like halfway through college. Um, I sit there and get so depressed about things. I have no motivation to do anything. Whether I got homework to do, whether I was gonna go see a friend, whether I was gonna go play on some Xbox or whatever. But I just want to sit down and lay down and just take a nap and not deal with reality. I just want to close my eyes and not exist for an hour or two. And so that person does that, right? Maybe this example does that. And now they do that as a response to what the hell is going on all up in here. And again, sometimes we do it for the first time to alleviate. And if it does give us some alleviation, guess what? We do it again. Very likely to. Right? We have that reward system in our brains. When something works for us and it alleviates stress, we can't help but our brain can't help but look at that like, hey, that's a viable option. You know, I like that movie Inside Out and how they like to talk about like all the little characters in your brain talking to each other, all the feelings. I think it's like that sometimes. Sometimes that's kind of how it feels when we're talking in therapy and we're trying to discuss what's going on. Yeah, it's kind of like that sometimes. And we sit there in a moment like, let's go with that. You know, let's do that. That worked. That seemed to work last time. This is why when I talk to clients who self-injure, a lot of them will say like, yeah, I mean, when I think of how I got caught up into it, there was an element of it worked before. It took away the pain before, or it, you know, made me not think about those things before when I fell asleep or whatever, or when I took that substance or whatever. And so whatever that behavior can be, it's going to do something to alleviate the pain, the suffering, to deal with things. So like I said, it could be napping, it could be substances, it could be angry outbursts, it could be avoidance, it could be a lot of things. You know, I remember a case when I worked at the hospital where I think it was something about nail biting to the point of like bleeding cuticles, stemming from anxiety or something. You know, there's so many different ways a behavior can be subtle, can be quiet, can be loud, but it's a pattern, becomes habitual, or becomes that way of dealing with it, right? However often it happens. So when this process occurs, at this point, a lot of clients start seeing the whole thing now. And they start realizing like, yeah, I get it now. I get now when I look back in my life and I look at all these problematic areas. And when I've acted like that, yeah, I can kind of start to see my brain was taking me somewhere. And I've always felt like that, you know. And it was in certain situations. Clients will ask me like, you know, what do I focus on in all this? And the big thing I say is you focus on the thoughts. But it's not worthless to focus on the others. The situations are helpful to consider because you may find patterns, you may find, you know, triggers to obviously avoid or develop adaptations towards or solutions for, etc. So it is worth looking at the situation, but it isn't worth sticking with because what I mean by that is sometimes clients will get focused. I remember when I worked at the outpatient, I remember I had one poor unfortunate woman who had some trauma. When I look back at it, she had some trauma that happened to her. And unfortunately, it was like this thing that she would do of getting into a litany of some story of what happened to her. And it would be this like, I don't know, I had one coworker who like called it this act, but it was like, that's not an act. That's like like she's getting tripped up, like a tape that gets stuck. You know, a tape that skips. It's like, oh, it's coming to that part where it's going to skip. That's what it was like for her. You know, for her, every time we got to this moment, we talked about this trauma or this thing would occur, she'd get like that tape would skip and she would get into this behavior of going through all the storyline of what happened and all this trauma, blah, blah. Because for her, that did something about what was going on in that moment, right? But it wouldn't do any good for her because she would just break down. She would just, you know, disrupt what was going on. She would usually avoid whatever, you know, therapeutic approach we were trying to get her to work on. Whatever would happen, it's unfortunate. We can get so drawn into these behaviors that they take over. So it helps to look at the situations and what happened to kind of understand how it connects to what's going on, but it isn't the best thing to focus on because when these things happen, they happen. They're over with. You can't undo what's already been done, for the most part, I think. You can't undo a situation. I can't tell someone to not say that out loud. Can you go back and take those words out of the existence of 5 minutes ago? Can't do that. You can't sit there and tell someone to undo something they just did. You can't tell your brain, don't think that because you just thought that. No, it's like saying, don't think of a pink elephant. Don't think of a pink elephant. Whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant. I'm sure half of you guys are thinking about a pink elephant right now. You can't not do certain things as far as like telling your brain not to. This way, it's a fun question sometimes we talk about in session. Do you really have free will? And this is why I like this topic. It kind of discusses the fact that there are these unconscious ways of thinking that I have that I've never really paid attention to that are actively working right now, and I'm not even realizing they're on duty. It's like you've got these unconscious thoughts or these distorted thoughts that are basically like employed, and you're paying them, and you didn't even know you got them employed. You didn't even know you hired them, and yet you're paying out their salaries. It's like, wait a minute, hold up. Let me find out if you're even a good employee to begin with if I want to keep you. That thought. Do I even think it's a good idea to think that I'll never get better? Do I think that's a good thing to employ in my mind? Do I think it's a good idea to employ the thought of, they don't like me, they never will? How helpful is that? Right? So when I can get a client to start looking at themselves and get out of that rut, they start to feel that sense of, I can put some thought and conscious effort into this. Hell yeah, you can. Choosing how to think is hard. When you start realizing there's certain values or unconscious beliefs that have been ingrained there, and it's like trying to walk against the current. You're not trying to do that. You're trying to roll with the current and then learn how to navigate in the water, trying not to hit the banks, right? So situations, good to focus on, but not the permanent thing. Thoughts are the main focus. Consequences are good to focus on too. They are. They're helpful, but not the main thing. I'll have some clients, and I've had some cases where it was like, fine, you're right. I should probably stop drinking. I'll stop drinking, or yeah, I'll stop taking naps. I'll get out more. But they don't want to look at the thoughts. They don't want to look at the feelings and that stuff that happens. Why they even do it. And so they might just like cold turkey something, right? They'll just stop doing something. And that can help. That can help to some level, right? They might be successful for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. And I've had clients do this before where it was like, yeah, I still haven't done that thing, Oz. And I'm like, hey, that's good, man. That's good. Let's keep it up. Are you sure you want to look at some of those thoughts? Let's look at those thoughts. It's not that bad. A lot of times they'll come back, or what will happen is that behavior will either return, so relapse, right? A relapse will occur. And I don't just mean about substance, right? If it was the sleeping, the napping, the over napping and shutting down example, right? I'll just stop napping, and then maybe like another situation that kid never planned for happens. He gets dumped, right? He gets dumped, or he fails a class or something, and that's never happened before. It's been a long time, and you can't just ignore that level of thought and feeling. So the whole cold turkey, I just won't do that, is really hard to hold back. And some clients, don't get me wrong, like I said, they may go back and do it. So he may decide to take a nap for 3 hours that day. But he may decide also, there's some instances where it's like, I'm not going to go back to what I used to do. But unfortunately, they'll just start something new that is equally unhealthy or worse. Sometimes less unhealthy, but still unhealthy. Right? So no, I won't nap. Maybe that example I'm using, they won't go back and nap because they know it was terrible. But now, I get why that cigarette feels nice for that friend. Maybe I'll go out and have a smoke instead. And in about 2 months' time, that person is going through now a pack a day, right? Or it could be something else. Let's not use a substance. They sit there and decide, instead of napping, instead of shutting down, they cut themselves. They punish themselves because they're so angry because they can't go back and do the old thing. But they're so angry about what's going on, so they hit themselves, right? Could be something different. We could manifest something new if we don't have the right guidance or the right idea. It's a vulnerability. And so I tell clients, yes, it's important to look at the thoughts. The thoughts are what we try to focus on. Focusing on how do we look at those distortions. So at this point, I start to talk to clients once we've discussed all this. I start to tell clients a little further, more about the thoughts. Because, this is good, that's good. But let's focus on this. Those distortions, like I say, are like gap fillers. Our brain is going through, like I say, so many things all the time. We're constantly thinking. Your brain is wired to make shortcuts if it can, to chunk things together. Like think of an assembly line. Like, let's chunk this stuff, send it down the line. Let's next. Come on, what else is going on? Why? Because you think of the world around you. Look around your room right now, wherever you are, wherever you're watching me right now. If you're in your room, if you're outside in your porch, if you're in your car, there's not many more other spots you can be, right? Wherever you're watching me, just look around you. Everything you see before you, you hear before you, you feel, you smell, taste. If you're eating something, snacking on something while you're watching this video, smell, whatever. I think I said that right. Those sensory inputs are how we take in the world. Everything around you. I kind of like to use that Matrix movie as an analogy when I talk in therapy about this, because to some degree it helps clients understand it. Like, yeah, you're right. Like, there's all these things around me. I know that this wall is this color. I'm colorblind, so whatever. This looks blue to me, right? And maybe it's a weird purple or something. I don't know. And the lights are different down here, so whatever. But the color I see on this wall is that color because of the photons that are bouncing off the wall with the light or whatever, and going into my cones and rods, and that interpretation of that information that I know is helping me understand that that's a wall, that that's something that exists right there. And so we're constantly taking in info. You have to have some kind of processing power up here that can efficiently take that data, understand it, and throw it down the line and act so you can figure out what to do. Not too long ago, we were all getting killed off by maybe bigger animals or something. What is that? They talk about that, the Bering Strait, right? With Bering Strait or that, whatever, that little stretch of land between Alaska and Russia or whatever. And now there used to be, what do they call those, short-faced bears or something? These dudes were like 12, 14 feet tall, and these things would just hunt down humans migrating across that stretch of land. Right, so I can understand, how that fight or flight response developed. Totally get it, but it still exists in us sometimes, or it does. It still exists in us, and in our situations, we have to be ready. So our brain's just built to just constantly process and get moving and get ready and be ready for the next thing, right? So many thoughts, so many things to process. Those distorted thoughts that I talk about, those thoughts can be ingrained too. I guess it's fair at this point, I try to tell clients more about the habitual stuff, right? So to some degree, I'm keeping a track of the time because, like I said, I wanted this to be about an hour or so, 40 minutes. Hopefully you sat through this good stuff. In your brain, you guys got about, what do they say, about 100 billion neurons or something like that. And one way I try to visualize this is like this, right? So if you can see this properly, I hope you can. This is like a little drawing I'm working on, which is trying to depict the neurons in your brain. Right, so you've got like the axon, what is it? Oh my God, all my terrible terms are fleeting from my brain. I remember this is the myelinated sheath, right? This is where the message gets thrown, the signal gets fired, right? And it shoots through this little stretch of the neuron, and those little hot doggy things make me information go faster. I remember that much from my anatomy classes. These thoughts, these actions, everything that's going on in us, these neurological connections have electricity firing off signals to do things, telling us, do this, do that. Right? Me tapping my finger up here right now, there's signals firing in my brain, electricity. I wish we could see it. That's sitting there and telling it, do that right now. And what I'm saying, and I tell clients, is that there's also something like that going on, or there is something like that going on with our habitual thoughts. Maybe it's an example of a young girl who's got low self-esteem because she's constantly, since she was young, been bullied, right? We'll take a classic example. And so there's a constant self of, I'm not good enough. That basic thought of, I'm not good enough, or I'm not that great. And that thought, right? That thought could be this pathway that fires off, and it started, right? It started like I like to use this analogy. Anybody who's ever been walking in a park or like a trail, and if you ever like look to the side, sometimes you catch like a little trail or a little side path that somebody walked through, but you can tell it wasn't meant to be a path. So it's like somebody went through here, but it's not supposed to go through here. That's like when you have that thought for the first time. You know, that electrical signal fires off, finds a new path in your brain to fire off for the first time. And it's like, you know, yeah, I'm not good enough. Maybe they don't like me. You know, maybe I do stink, or maybe it is my fault. Whatever the distorted thought is, the doubt or whatever. And we have that thought. And then what happens is the more times situations like that happen, the more times we are likely to think like that and then behave as follows. It's like that path in your brain gets fired again and again and again and again and again and again until the point where maybe years pass. And now that thought process is ingrained in you and it's very hard to stop. You know, and at this point, because the brain's growing, those connections are growing. Think of like a spider web that just like slowly grows more and more and more, like this mycelium network, right? Like all those little mushroom networks, that fungi and stuff that just spread across a field or something. Think of it like that as you grow up older and older, as you develop more and more interactions with reality and build upon that understanding of the world. That distorted thought gets further out, umbrelling, unfolding into other areas of your life, other dynamics, other systems that you become a part of. School, work, relationships, hobbies, your looks, pets, you know, politics, religion, philosophy, anything. So it's important to take a look at that. It's important to consider, what do my thoughts tell me? Where do they come from? Why do I think that way? These habitual ways of thinking can be very difficult, I understand. They can be very hard because we've been thinking about it maybe for a long time. But it helps, this cognitive process helps uncover how that's possible. And so I like to tell clients, you know, when we see an obvious toxic cognitive process, right? I have these situations and I think these distorted thoughts, or I'll sit there and have a black and white way of thinking, or I'll should on myself, or I'll mind read. God, that's such a big one in today's society, is mind reading. But for clients, I can see the feel good in them when they start letting go of the old way and they see a new way of looking at something. And it makes perfect sense. They're not tricking themselves. They're just finally waking up to what's real. And then that's part of what we're trying to do, is challenge these distorted thoughts, challenge the black and white thinking, challenge the mind reading, challenge the should statements, right? The perfectionism, the worrier, the critic, whatever, right? The victims in us. We try to challenge those thoughts and into maybe a more, rational perspective. Because then what follows is trying to rebuild a new process. You know, we sit there and are trying to make a new path, a new way of looking at something, like a fork in the road. I'm no longer going to go down that way. That's why I remember now another professor telling me, you know, sometimes with therapy, you're trying to help clients see the unconscious into conscious, which just reminds me of a funny meme nowadays, or a funny quote about what has been seen cannot be unseen. Absolutely. You know, when you start seeing the little thought process that happens and you now know what it does, it's hard to lie to yourself about that sometimes. So let me explain. Maybe a client starts to realize they like to mind read. They sit there with their spouse, right? And they say, well, whenever she gets mad at me, I just assume she's pissed at me because of this. And it's like, okay, but did she say that? Well, no, she didn't say that. Right. So what happens, right? So you say this, she says this. She says, all right, I'm gonna go see a friend, or I'm gonna go take care of the basement, or I'm gonna go do this. But does she say she hates you? Does she say she no longer, cares about you? No. It's like, right. Well, what happens? Well, I'm saying that. Right. Or I'm assuming that, or it feels like that, right? But it's not what she's saying. Right. There's another distortion called emotional reasoning. I feel this way, therefore it must be that way. It's not how it works. Remember what I said earlier. Feelings are always right. Yes, you can feel that way, but you got to understand how you came to feel that way, because that can be wrong. That can be irrational. And if you tidy it up a little bit, or sharpen it up, or make it more rational, you'll have a more accurate feeling. Maybe a different feeling, or a more accurate one. So I'll have a client that will sit there and, I'm saying that. I'm making those statements up. Okay. So now we catch the distortion, right? Then I'll give them the assignment. At this point, I think I learned this assignment more so in my graduate courses. But the assignment is helpful for any clients that are willing to participate. So I encourage you guys, if you've been watching this and continuing to watch this, I encourage you to try this. If you go through and look up these cognitive distortions, and there's a great list from that book, Feeling Good by David Burns. Great book, good reference, I believe. And I liked his little outline of the 10 distortions. But you can find these things on Google. Man, just Google it up real quick and you'll find, a lot of hits. Take a look at those, maybe first 5 hits, the top hits, like maybe the APA website, maybe the NAMI website might come up. Some other websites might come up, these big organizations. But look for a definition, read a couple examples. Take some time to think about maybe the stressful situations in your life, or maybe you have some not so great behaviors that you're trying to change. And ask yourself, do I do that distortion? Is that what kind of my brain starts to, turn on in its perspective when I'm in those moments? And if you identify a distortion and you're like, oh, that's me to a T, I do that. Don't freak out, first of all, don't panic. A lot of times when I teach this stuff and we go through the distortions, and I used to teach this in a group at the hospital when I worked inpatient and outpatient, and I'd often have at least 1 or 2 clients that would come up to me during or after the session and be like, Ozzy, I do all these things. Am I really, really messed up, or am I in trouble? Like, I do all this. Now we have a good chuckle because it doesn't mean that. It means you're human. You know what I mean? Like we all do them. And trust me, when you look these up, if you don't know what I'm talking about and you look them up, you're going to relate to them. You're going to relate to at least a handful of them. And that's okay because you're human. The point, though, is to realize not to get tripped up in life where you're using them consciously or unconsciously all the time. Sometimes we use them for particular things. Sometimes we use them just because. And it's good to pay attention, build self-awareness, and find out if you really should be doing that and looking at it that way. So when you look up these distortions and you identify which one might be your top 1 or 2, what I would encourage you to do, what I encourage clients to do, is when we identify it, all that jazz, I ask them to track it in some way for the next 2 weeks, right? So for the next 2 weeks, they sit there with a little note card. All right, I do number 5, which is mind reading, and number 8, which is just should statements. And they'll carry that note card with them in a pocket, in their wallet, in their purse, whatever. They'll basically track it for whenever it comes up. They'll go about their day. I'll encourage them, go about your day, go about your schedule, and do your thing. But if you catch yourself, maybe doing that behavior, maybe feeling that emotion, ask yourself, if you can, take a step back and ask if I've been doing that distortion. And if you have, pull out the note card, make a tally mark, put it back, and move on. Others will put it on their phone under a certain app or whatever. That's fine. Keep track however you'd like. But try your best to just tally every time you think that way, think like that or act like that, particularly think that way. And the goal is to help a client do this, and after 2 weeks, tally up the totals and take a look at it. Try not to look at that number, every day. Just tally and put that number, stash it somewhere. Don't try to look at the tallies throughout the week. Wait to the end of the whole 2 weeks to really add them all up. I've had some clients that'll even depending on what their job is, they'll carry items in their pocket, something small like grains or not grains, but like pinto beans or little beads or something from jewelry making. And every time they have that thought, they'll take it from one pocket and put it in the other. I think that's a good idea too. But what happens is usually within about a week and a half, I'll follow up with a client and they'll already be telling me, yeah, man, every time, I do that thing and I know what I'm doing. And I catch myself sometimes. Some of them are even lucky enough to stop. They'll realize what they're thinking and they'll just stop themselves from doing. They realize that they can't undo it and they know how distorted it is. It doesn't do any good. It's trickery. And they don't really feel so inclined to do the behavior as much. But they're stuck because they're like, I don't know what to do now. I can't do this, but what do I do? Right? Something has to happen. I got to pass that emotion out in some way. So we work on building that. But I encourage you to try that out. Take a look at what those distortions are. And when you find them, as you start to see them, I would encourage you to start looking at how to challenge them. Question those thoughts. Don't accept them just outright if it's a distortion. In fact, I tell clients, if you know you're having a distortion, it's a distortion, then you can be guaranteed there's got to be a better way of looking at it. There has to be. So don't settle for that distortion. Try to fight for a better way. trying to think what else could be helpful, because there's a lot more to say. I often teach this to clients in about 2 or 3 sessions, and I don't often just ramble like this the whole time. I do teach it, but I also incorporate what's going on in the client's life. So maybe we're using more personal examples as we go through this process. This video again is just to be educational, in hopes that the information I have to say about this gets you guys thinking, perhaps, whoever's watching. It's by no measure a substitute for therapy. And I would encourage you, if you have a therapist and you're seeing this video, maybe bring it up to your therapist if y'all haven't talked about this. If y'all did talk about it and you decided to maybe put it off, or it got overlooked, or go back and revisit it. Go back and revisit the topic. Maybe there's some things I'm off on, or something I didn't add that's, much deeper to it. Talk about it, explore with the therapist, man. It'd be great. It'd be a good thing. If you aren't having therapy and what I'm saying makes sense, but you don't think you need therapy, it's fine. Talk about this with a dear person of yours, maybe a good friend, or your partner, or a loved one, or a friend you like to just kick back and unwind with, or something, or talk random crap with, whatever. Somebody close that you trust, that you could talk to about this stuff if you find it interesting. If you think you do connect with what I'm saying and it makes sense, and you're like, yeah, I definitely get this, and I totally believe in it, definitely makes sense, and I do this, yeah. But I don't know if I'm in a bad spot or not, or maybe I am feeling it. Seek therapy, seek some counseling, talk to somebody, talk to some help, even talk to your support systems. Maybe even starting there and talking to somebody you care and know you feel connected with, or are able to trust. It's tough, man. I know people come to therapy and it's difficult sometimes, and I'm happy to work with the clients that I have and the clients that come in, because to help them see some kind of change in their life is really, really good. It's difficult for us to change sometimes, but I believe it's possible. And I think this cognitive therapy stuff is a great way to start doing some of that. So I hope this video is helpful. There's probably some more that I'll make as part of the cognitive therapy stuff, because there's things to talk about as far as the thoughts. I got to talk about the distortions a little more, but I feel like I may have talked a lot, so I don't want to go too far. I'll make another video for sure, but I hope you guys found this useful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Please pass this information on if you found it useful and thought it'd be good to talk with somebody else, blah, blah, blah. Share it, maybe somebody who you've tried talking to about this, or has brought it up and they want more information. Man, show them this stuff. Talk to you guys next time. Take care. Hope y'all have a good one.